This is the Triratna Dharma training course for Mitras. If you haven't already viewed the introductory orientation session with the reference 1.1.0, please do. This is a non-professional recording fitted into my week as and when I'm able, so apologies for background noise. A PDF of the material can be found on freebuddhistaudio.com under the community section, and a hard copy is available on lulu.com. This project requires people to interact with the material and to ask questions in the comments. Once 5 questions have been asked, I will answer them in a separate video. It's helpful to me that you ask questions, as then I know that what I'm doing is enjoyed and being engaged with and of value, which is kind of why I'm doing it. This is Year 1, Part 1, Week 2, Questions and Answers. 1.1.2 What is a Buddhist? So a few different questions this week. First one was, who was Angulimala? Angulimala was a name that was given to a serial killer in the Buddha's day. His name means finger necklace, and he wore a necklace of the severed fingers of all the people that he'd killed, which is pretty gruesome. He'd got a pretty fearsome reputation, and he lived in the areas between towns, which were, well, extremely dangerous back in that time because there was very little policing that went on anyway, and obviously in the spaces between towns there was nothing at all really. He came on the Buddha one day when he was walking down the road, and an interesting interaction happened where he shouted to the Buddha, "Stop," and the Buddha said, "No, you stop." And they got into a short interaction, and one way or another things changed quite dramatically for him. He stopped murdering people, and he became a bhikkhu, which is a wandering monk. Fairly quickly, we're told, he'd become enlightened, but even still he was stuck with the consequences of his actions. So around about that time, the local chieftain, sort of the head of a nearby clan, had put together what was described as a small army who were going around the countryside looking for this guy to kill him. This warband came across the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "What would I tell you if he'd given up his life of crime and was a wandering bhikkhu? He'd sort of taken on the Dharma, and he'd changed." And their response was, "Well, if you can vouch for him, if that's what he's done, then we'd leave him alone." And they did. However, the local population didn't. Even though he was beyond the internal mechanism for suffering, he was still subject to a lot of abuse from the local population. So that's a very brief story. What are we going for refuge from? So yeah, the text does very briefly say that we're going to refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma and Sangha, but we're going for refuge from pain. The term going for refuge is often bandied around just in those words, going for refuge. Usually what they mean in a Buddhist context is going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. But we're always going for refuge to something. The landscape is one of our given experience is incredibly intense, incredibly difficult to predict. It's multifaceted and multidimensional because you've got sound, and you've got sight, and you've got taste, and you've got touch, and you've got all the mental objects as well coming to you. You've got emotions, you've got volitions. There are so many different layers, and all of them are actually pretty intense. And it's actually the bandwidth of experience of life that is coming at you is just greater than what you can possibly engage with. It's just too much. And then when you start to bring into that, you trying to work out the consequences of what's going on and your agency in that, it's just, the world is like a storm. Life is a bit like a storm, really. And pain is part of that. But I think in some ways saying that we're going for refuge from pain is a little bit simplistic, and I think it can be filled out, because you can also go for refuge from pleasure or neutrality. I think often neutrality, a sort of boredom, I would say. I think a lot of people would prefer to be in a painful situation than in a neutral situation. Also, it's quite possible to be more afraid of pleasure than you are of pain, because you're afraid of losing pleasure. If you have pleasure, or if you have gain, or if you have status, or if you have the things that we consider to be good, you can be afraid of that. So I think pain is an obvious, and probably the most obvious thing that we go for refuge from. But I think actually we run from nearly every and any experience. You can run from loneliness just as easy as you can run from connection just as easily. Some people overeat and some people undereat. We're an incredibly sophisticated creature in that sense, and the landscape is very, very varied between people and in ourselves. It's multifaceted. So exactly what we are going for refuge from, what we're trying to get away from, what we're afraid of, what troubles us, what overwhelms us, really it's anything, actually. I'd say it's pretty much anything. Whatever you can't handle, whatever you don't want to experience. In a lot of senses, I think a lot of the time we probably don't even know what we're running from. It's such a habitual, compulsive thing. For example, it probably feels like you are trying to avoid a conversation with your boss. That's the immediate thing that's presented to you. But actually underneath that, you are trying to avoid making a scene or making yourself not being liked. But then under that, you're trying to avoid some other thing about approval, who knows what. It sort of goes down in various layers. Often the things that we're most in contact with are the immediate samskaras. That's another word for habit. The immediate habits and the immediate compulsions, but actually they're multi-layered and following a thread all the way down to the source. The source, the thing that we're actually afraid of, we may not even ever really come into contact with. So that's what you're going for refuge from. And of course, you can go for refuge to all sorts of things, not just the Buddha and Dharma and Sangha. So if you need to have this conversation with your boss, for example, and you don't want to, you can go for refuge to, you could go for refuge to alcohol, let's say. You just don't have the conversation and you find that you're drinking more at the weekend. Or you could go for refuge to a friend that you know, and you could gossip about your boss and say how bad he is because he doesn't really want to hear what you have to say. You could say that. Or you could maybe be a little bit more useful. You could talk to a friend, go for refuge to them, and they might, if they're worth their salt as a friend, they might challenge you on that, and they might encourage you to look at something, or to behave in a slightly different way, or to encourage you, or whatever it happens to be. So there's a wide world of things that we go for refuge to, and some of the things that we go for refuge to actually meet the need of what we're going for refuge from. If you're hungry and you go for refuge to a relatively healthy and pleasant meal, that kind of works. That's a reasonable refuge. That's an appropriate refuge to go to if you're hungry. If you're lonely and you go for refuge to food, that is even though it's the same refuge, it's not an appropriate refuge. It doesn't actually do the thing that you want. Anyway, I hope that makes it clear. Why is the ideal depicted as a human in form? So I presume this is about images of the Buddha. The ideal of enlightenment is depicted in human form. It's also depicted in non-human form. A Vajra is a depiction of transcendental energy, the lotus of compassion. There's images of books, of swords for wisdom. There's all sorts of images. I once saw a shrine where there was a large lotus, and on the lotus there was a door frame. It was actually in a building site. It was a place that was being made at the time, and the image of enlightenment that was at the front of the shrine room, I think they just put it there because it's just what they had and they didn't have a Buddha at the time, but it was a door frame with a door, which I thought was actually quite it conveyed something of value. A doorway is a transitional icon. It's leading you to a different space, and I thought that was very effective. With that said, most of the time, I would say, the ideal is depicted in human form. It's depicted as a personality of sorts, as something that we are equipped psychologically to be interested in. I think it's humans. We can tell minute differences in human faces in a way that we can't tell minute differences in a pattern of cloth or vehicles, or there's something hardwired in us to be acutely aware of human form, probably for good reason. So why is that? Probably a few reasons. The ones that I can think of is the time in our lives of most radical growth and development was very likely when we were children. And when you're a child, you grow by having relationships with people, empathizing with them, being around them, relating to them, and imitating them. That's generally how you learn as a kid. This is a somatic process, so you actually do these things, and it's also an imaginative process in that you actually attempt to become them. For a short period in a day, you might actually be a doctor or a soldier or whatever the type of person that you're exploring and inhabiting at that time, and you sort of become it for a while. I think the most noteworthy thing about that process is that it's not thought-based. It's not an effort. It's not something that a child is working at. A child doesn't try to grow up. It just wants to play. It just wants to engage with the living creatures around it and inhabit different ways of being and it sort of soaks up the world. Well, it soaks up the people around it, let's say. I mean, a kid will absorb facts for sure, but really it's absorbing the people and the culture and the characters and the values around it by a process of osmosis. Now, believe it or not, you still have that in you. And when you're looking towards growth, when you're looking towards stepping outside of the known, the rational, reasonable, logical mind is not that useful for that. And so if you can, when you look at a Buddha image, particularly in a shrine room, the main Buddha image, I usually find this in a shrine room, imagine that there's somebody looking out of those eyes. And sometimes you'll find that the face looks grumpy, or sometimes you'll find that it looks a bit more kind. Sometimes you'll find it takes on particular characteristics or not. And really that's just a process of playing with your imagination. And I find that's generally quite effective. It's not something that you have to do, but I would recommend you engage with the ideal as a human ideal, as a character, engage with the Buddha as a character. I think this is one of those areas that you have to just give a go. If there's a Buddha image that you see online or in a shop that particularly stands out to you, I don't think you need to ask yourself rationally why that is, or maybe just buy it, maybe just get that image, maybe just have that image on the backdrop of your phone, or whatever it happens to be. Certain images will stand out to you, and certain images will capture your imagination. You don't really get to choose what they are, generally. I think you can, to some degree, lean into things or not, but I don't think you can directly control it. And just see where that takes you. Yeah. What is a bodhisattva? So this is an interesting one. It kind of follows on from the last question a little bit. When the Buddha was alive, he gave teachings which were tailored to the person in front of him. He didn't really have a defined system. It was systematized much later into a more of a philosophical or psychological framework. But quite a bit was lost when he died. In that, when you read the Pali Canon, when you read the words of the Buddha, they are generally about practices and principles and how to use your mind and what processes lead to particular outcomes in your mind and how to do them best. It can seem a little bit square, a little bit cold, let's say. I think if you really get into the scriptures, that's not the case, but I think for most it can feel like that. And that apparently is an outcome of him being dead, because when he died, his attendant, Ananda, who was the person who was closest to him, he'd followed him round for decades and seen all sorts of crazy stuff happen, him talk with murderers and kings and queens and everybody. What most concerned Ananda, when he knew the Buddha was going to die, what he said that he missed the most was that he'd miss his kindness. And so what the Buddha was conveying was very matter-of-fact and pragmatic and down-to-earth, but how he conveyed it, there was a significant humanity or a significant kindness and openness and empathy that was present in his discourse, which is lost in the words. So fast forward 200, 300 years after the Buddha died, Buddhism had become, in some people's mind, a bit formulaic. It was just lists. And they had an intuition that if the Buddha was around, there would be another facet to it. The compassion side would be much, much more present. 200 or 300 years after the Buddha had died, the criticism was that people were now trying to get enlightened for themselves. It had become a navel-gazing, self-indulgent thing. And that wasn't the real deal. You can't actually get enlightened for yourself. It doesn't really work. And so they posited something new, but in a way it was actually old. It was the original ideal, that you're doing it for compassion for all beings. And this really went into imaginative heights and flights. This is called the Mahayana. So they called it the Mahayana, which means the great vehicle. So the insinuation here is that it's a form of Buddhism that can carry everybody to enlightenment, whereas they called the previous school, rather pejoratively, the Hinayana, which means the little vehicle. It's a bit of a derogatory way of saying it's an inferior type of Buddhism. So there was some disagreement between these two schools. The sort of earlier school was along the lines of, look, if you were in a hole, if you're embroiled in the world, the thing to do is just get out yourself. You yourself learn how to become enlightened. You get out of the hole and then you help people out of the hole. You can't help people out of the hole whilst you're in the hole yourself. You've got to get out first. And so it's an individual effort and then you help others. Whereas the Mahayana were, no, we all need to get out together. We all need to do this for the sake of each other, for the sake of all beings. I think there's a validity in both, I think. Most people find one more appealing than the other. But one of the ways that the Mahayana, this new school, depicted this ideal was with the Bodhisattva. So a Bodhisattva is somebody who practices for the benefit of all beings. And that's their main motivation. And usually what happens with a Buddha is the traditional view is that you're reborn again and again and again through different lives. But as soon as you become a Buddha, you're no longer reborn. Yeah. So the ideal of the Bodhisattva was to never become enlightened, get right the way up, almost to enlightenment, so you're as qualified and capable and wise and compassionate as you can possibly be, but then you never quite do that last step because you're waiting for the rest of the universe to come with you. So it's one of the vows is I won't get enlightened until all beings are enlightened. So if you take this literally, it gets a little bit silly because that means at the end of time, when all beings are enlightened, you've just got this long line of bodhisattvas waiting for enlightenment saying, oh no, after you, oh no, after you, oh no, after you, no, please, you go first, which is absolutely ridiculous. If you take this as a metaphysical proposal, I think you're going to get stuck. But I think if you take it as an imaginative and a really beautifully mythical framework, I think it's got a lot in it. So there's lots of bodhisattvas. Some of them are historical figures. Some of them are more imaginative. And they're related to in very much the same way as the Buddha. Each of them usually has particular characteristics that they excel at, let's say. There's bodhisattvas of compassion or wisdom or energy or purity or abundance or whatever it happens to be. There's all sorts of different characters of these bodhisattvas, thousands of them probably. Is going for refuge the same as the Christian concept of salvation? I'm not really very qualified to answer this because I don't really know that much about Christianity. My experience of it was only from when I was fairly young. Faithforward.org says, salvation is God's grace. It is the gift of freedom from our sins that Jesus made possible by taking the punishment for our sins on the cross. Romans 10, verses 9 to 10 says that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. And finally, the ultimate authority on all things, Wikipedia, says, in Christianity, salvation, which is deliverance or redemption, same thing, is the saving of human beings from sin and its consequences, which include death and separation from God. And this happens by Christ's death and resurrection and the justification following his salvation. I don't really understand most of that. So I might just talk a little around it. It sounds like it's got some overlaps. It appears that salvation is the Christian method of overcoming suffering. It appears like it's heaven, basically. That it is posed as a effective solution against our existential situation. That seems to be an overlap. Both appear to be a suggestion of what you can do about the fact that you experience suffering, that you are going to die, that things are insubstantial. Another overlap is that it requires orienting your body, your speech, and your mind in accordance with the principle for it to manifest. For salvation to really be effective, you kind of need to put yourself completely behind it by the sounds of things. Although I don't really know how that plays out in terms of the Catholic Church, because I think going to confession is enough. I don't really know. Anyway, I'm not going to talk any further about that because I don't know. And I'd say the other overlap is that it appears to be the highest ideal for a human. Salvation, from a Christian point of view, seems to be the highest ideal for a human, and fully going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha would be that for a Buddhist. I think there's probably also differences. Again, I'm not entirely qualified, but at first glance, I'd say I'm not quite sure that salvation can be verified in your lived experience. I think you get to know about it at the point that you die. Whereas my sense is that placing confidence in the way that you relate to reality in this given moment and the way that you engage with your mental states appears to me something that can be verified here and now, to some degree at least. Obviously not to its fullest degree because I'm not there, but I do know that when I engage with my experience with more characteristics that I would think of as part of an enlightened mind at least, things play out differently, things play out better for me. I think the other thing that seems to be quite different is that with salvation, somebody else grants it to you, whereas enlightenment or insight, it isn't granted to you from an external body in any way. intuiting what is maybe behind this question, which I think I'm going to extend myself a little bit, is going for refuge the same as a Christian sense of salvation? If the person asking this question has been Christian or has a Christian upbringing, it's quite a curious process of translating one's conditioning to, if you choose to use a different framework to interpret and make sense of this strange thing we call life, how to do that. So speaking personally, some Buddhists bow when they're at a shrine, and it took me a little while for me to become comfortable with bowing and more ritualistic aspects of practice. I really reacted quite strongly against it when I first come into contact with it. But once I'd sort of got over that and the heat of that, I actually found out that bowing didn't really do much for me. Some people actually prostrate and they lie themselves flat on the floor in front of the shrine. After a while, I found that I could bow and I could also prostrate, and it didn't really have any response. I could sort of do it, and I could kind of do it on autopilot. It didn't mean much to me. I did have a sword at the time. I bought a sword because I was experimenting. I'd got a huge shrine at that time, absolutely huge, and there was lots of objects on it, and I used to sit in front of the shrine and I just used to observe what objects came to my attention. I was sort of trying to find a way into ritual. I was trying to bridge this gap between these unusual terms and unusual ideas and ideals and images that were presented by a traditional school of Buddhism and my own meanderings in life. And what I did find is that you'll sometimes see it in churches where there are knights and they're bowing to a cross. It's usually statues, and a knight is down on one knee, and he's got his sword, and he's got his head bowed down. He's on one knee, and he's presenting the sword to whatever it is that he's bowing to. And that's quite an interesting symbol. That the thing that's in front of you, you are offering up your potency to that thing. You're offering your sword, the hilt of your sword. You're also presenting the back of your neck. So you're essentially saying, this thing in front of me, if you want to strike me down with my own sword, with my own potency, I'm okay with that. There's a sort of very, very strong giving yourself over. Now, in some ways, that's kind of exactly the same thing as what you're doing when you're prostrating or you're bowing. But culturally, that made sense to me. And it took me quite some time. I think after a while I knew rationally what I was doing, but rationally I don't think it makes any bloody difference. You've actually got to live it through. And it took a couple of years of me, whenever I bowed to my shrine, I didn't bow. I did this thing. I presented my sword to my shrine, and over time, somehow I was able to translate doing that, which did have an emotional potency to it. I was able to translate it to bowing and to prostrating. And now when I do bow and I prostrate, it does actually mean something to me, which is very fortunate because it just isn't very practical for me to carry my sword to the Buddhist center. So in some ways, whether going for refuge is the same as salvation or different, or in what ways it's the same or in what ways it's different, I can give you the technical, I can read out Wikipedia articles and talk about the facts of what's this or that or the other. But I'd say most of that is going to be your intuitive, emotive, mythical relationship to these things. And working that out might take some time. So if that's what's behind this question, then I'd say that whatever I say isn't going to be adequate, you've got to play with it. Actually, you've got to work out what that means for you. If the word salvation and the idea of salvation have potency for you, you can't just throw them away. That would be a tragedy. You might need to translate them or work out what it means, and that will probably take some time, and you'll probably have to talk about it quite a lot, and I wish you the best with that. There's one more question we have, which is, how does Triratna as an organisation feel about dualism, practicing Buddhism whilst in a religious context belonging to a church or mosque, etc.? And is it really possible? So this term dualism here is slightly different to a philosophical dualism in terms of the self and other dichotomy as it's sometimes presented. This is dualism in terms of practicing two different faiths at the same time. So in terms of the question as directly asked, how does Triratna as an organisation feel? I mean, the organisation itself doesn't sort of feel anything in particular. There would probably be a wide variety of different responses to that from people within the movement. And as one person in the movement, how do I feel about it? For me, I don't think that's ever really been a thing that I've wanted to do. I've been quite straightforwardly up for what's presented. Well, broadly, I mean, obviously there's been things here and there, but I certainly haven't been in conflict around. I haven't been in conscious conflict around putting all my chips into this project. As mentioned in the previous question, though, I do find that although in my mind and what my commitment is and what my intention is and that what my belief is largely based around a fairly orthodox Triratna sort of presentation, I'm not culturally a Buddhist. I am culturally a Christian. So in terms of what I put on my census, let's say, if I'm talking about what I think I am, I'd certainly put Buddhist. But I think if I was trying to convey to somebody what my lifestyle was like, for their benefit, not for mine, it probably looks more Protestant, I would say, in terms of the arc of my life. But internally there isn't a conflict between that. I find that kneeling at my shrine with a sword just happens to have a greater emotional response to it than bowing. But that's not beyond change. Like I can do something about that, and I need to make a decision whether changing that language is worth it or not, worth the effort of doing that or not. Another angle on this is what Sangharakshita has said on this kind of subject. I think when he started the movement, he was concerned around the spiritual supermarket. All of a sudden in the 60s, every kind of religion was open to everybody. In fact, now with the internet, even more so. And the tendency can be in modern life is to dabble in lots and lots of different things. And it's sometimes likened to trying to dig a well. And if you start 10 different wells and only dig down 3 or 4 feet, you won't really get to the thing that you're looking to get to. If what religion was presenting was a purely thought-based thing, then that would be fine. With a decent education, you can usually conceptually understand a religion relatively quickly. But to go deep in a system of practice requires a lot of time and a lot of commitment. To go deep with people, it requires the same. And unless you don't have a job and you've got lots and lots of spare time, I would say that pursuing a single method of practice is going to be helpful for you. Of course, if you're not looking for that depth and you're interested in breadth, looking at comparative religion is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Really, one aspect of this question is, what is it that you're trying to do? Another thing about commitment, well, it's not just commitment, I'd say it's exclusivity, because there is a difference between commitment and exclusivity. You can actually be committed to lots of different things, to different religions or to different partners, let's say, but to be exclusive means that you're actively not committing to other things, usually so that you have the resources available to have a greater commitment with the one thing that you are involved in. One aspect of that is around not picking and choosing. So, for example, if you were to be wanting to lose weight, and so you took on Weight Watchers and Slimming World and I don't know any others, some other one, let's say. Now, Weight Watchers allows you to have 2 cakes a week, and Slimming World allows you to have 3 cakes a week, and this other one allows you to have 5 cakes a week. And so you end up, because you're taking on all these things, you end up allowing yourself to pick the best bits of all of them. Which, if you're highly qualified in a spiritual sense, and if you're very savvy and you truly do know what's good for you, and you have the maturity to understand that, and you really do understand the system of practice and all the consequences of the system of practice, all of these different system of practices, you're effectively creating your own religion there. You're sort of piecing together those different things, or in this situation, you're piecing together your own diet. And that could go very well. If you're not as mature as you might think or might hope, you can end up just selecting the things that you like. And you're probably not going to get far with just selecting the things that you like. So, speaking from personal experience, my first period in the movement was quite easy, quite spontaneously enthusiastic. I'd very happily meditate. I'd very happily do all the things that were going on. There were a few things, like puja, as I've mentioned earlier, that I didn't really like, and I just avoided them, actually. And I told myself that was because puja wasn't worthwhile. It didn't do anything for me. It was nonsense. I then asked for ordination. And one of the things with ordination is that it is very much about your own personal practice. But at the same time, the other thing is that if you're going to be an order member and if you're going to be teaching, and if people are going to be looking to you to ask what the different practices are, you've got to know them for the sake of other people. And you've also got to know them for yourself, and that's not just an idea of them. You've actually got to have tried them all. And this I found very difficult, because I thought that these people were trying to make me do something that I didn't want to do. So I'd go to ordination retreats, and unlike the beginner retreats, there was a strong emphasis on turn up to everything, come to everything on the itinerary every day, and just do the whole thing. And I didn't like this at all, because I thought that they were trying to get me to do things that I didn't want to do, and that I knew better,
these things weren't any good for me. I wasn't interested in it. I would rather go off and do my own thing when the puja was happening, or when this was going on, and I could pick and choose whatever it is that I liked. And of course, I wouldn't say that it was just that I liked this or didn't like this. I would come up with some clear rationalisation of why this thing was actually a bad idea to do. And I genuinely believed that. It actually ended up with a conversation with one of the ordination team where I said to them that I don't want to go to puja because it doesn't work. And he was very polite, but a little bit pokey. And his response wasn't to present another view on whether it did work or didn't. But what he said was, "You are not qualified to say that," which I thought was really good. I'd only ever done puja a handful of times. I hadn't really given myself to it. I hadn't put the hours in. And so fair enough for me to say I don't want to do puja. That's fine. You know, there's a lot of times when a lot of us don't want to do the practice that we're committed to, and that's how we deal with that, whether we do it or not. That's another question. But to say that it's no good, I hadn't put the hours in to work out whether that was true or not. And so he said, come to the puja, apply yourself, and do that for the rest of the ordination process, and maybe for 10 or 15 years after that. And after that, you'll be able to speak from a position of authority on whether it's of value to you and for you. Lo and behold, I did do that. And now I think that ritual and puja and chanting and the more intuitive, imaginative, mythical, communal, even mystical aspects of practice are far more potent than I give them credit for. I wouldn't have been able to learn that had I been left to my own choice. Now, that's not to say that you should just say to some order member or to say to some religion, tell me what to do and I'll do it, because that doesn't work either. That guy didn't tell me that I must do it, but he did point out that expertise only really comes from experience. It doesn't come from anywhere else. If I want to have expertise in Buddhism, I've got to have the experience. And you don't get that unless you see it through one way or another. That doesn't necessarily require you to be exclusive to one religion or one system of practice or one philosophy. But I would say that exclusivity and commitment very much support that. You're pushed up against your own limitations in a way that you probably wouldn't be otherwise. The last aspect of this question, I think, would be more philosophical around views. So technically speaking, the core insight of the Buddha was that all things arise in dependence upon conditions. If the philosophical or metaphysical position of Buddhism could be absolutely distilled right down to one sentence, that would be it. All things arise in dependence upon conditions. Things happen, and they bring into being the next set of things that can happen. And there is never any exception to that rule. That is the way that the universe works. And three things that come further from that, which we'll do later in this course, so I don't think you need to remember these specifically, but because all things are conditioned, all things are impermanent, because if they're made, they can be unmade. All things are insubstantial, in that nothing makes itself. Nothing is exempt from that flow of conditions. And also all things are unsatisfactory, in that no permutation of events can totally and finally resolve the longings of the human heart. They are the absolute core position of Buddhism. Now, if you really do hold them as true, or even if you're really looking into them as true, let's say, because I don't think you need to just take them on as taught, you actually need to explore in your experience whether those things are true. There's just no room for God. God is permanent. God is not conditioned by anything. He's the thing that conditions all things, but nothing came before him, nothing created God. And most creator gods have some form of heaven which is purported to be an entirely satisfactory realm, and that's permanent, that goes on forever. I don't think those contradictions would come up quickly. I think it might take a number of years for those two worldviews to collide. But I think if you were trying to run a theistic system as well as a Buddhist system, I think you're inevitably going to run into, well, confusion at best, let's say. And eventually you're either going to have to drop one of them, or you're going to have to do some pretty spectacular mental contortions, or you're just going to have to pretend. Yeah, it comes up with complexities, I think. With that said, I think you can, quite legitimately, be a Christian and take on Buddhist practices. I think a lot of the Buddhist practices particularly don't require any worldview that comes with them. You can do the metta bhavana, and you can believe that that loving kindness is God's will and will get you into heaven. You can do the metta bhavana for any reason that you like. Same with the mindfulness of breathing. Same with Buddhist ethics. So if Christianity is your primary thing, I think you can add Buddhist practicalities and more of a Buddhist lifestyle, let's say, onto that. I think it's maybe a little bit more difficult to do it the other way round, where you have Buddhism as your primary thing and then you add on top of that prayer to a creator God. I think that's difficult because I think prayer would require you to have some kind of belief in who you're praying to and why and what the consequences are, in a way that doing the metta bhavana probably wouldn't. There's one final facet of this which I think is actually quite valid, and I think particularly valid in Triratna because it's a relatively new movement. The Triratna Buddhist community, which is TBC, to be confirmed, I quite like that. It's in its first century of operation. It's still quite fluid. It's still finding its feet in the culture that it's found itself. And there are certainly people in the movement who are practicing within Triratna, and they may go to other Buddhist groups as well, because they find that maybe the way that meditation is taught in that group is more amenable to them. Something that's not exactly synonymous with how many different religions or different schools that you're attending, but I think is in the same ballpark area, is the way that you relate to the Sangha or the Buddhist centre or the system of practice or the discipline that you have, as a thing that can fulfill your needs or as something that you are responsible to or responsible for. The most striking example of this is when I was young, I would go to a friend's house, and when you're at your friend's house, you go to dinner and you're served dinner, and it gets to the end and they take your plate away, and then they come and bring you pudding, and someone goes and does the washing up or whatever, and the rest of the people stick around the table and talk, and they sort of host you, basically. There's something really lovely about being hosted and being a recipient of that generosity. But several weeks in, or after a few months, or whatever it happens to be, you'll find that you go around to dinner, and at the end of dinner, instead of serving you in quite the same way, they might ask you to help wash up. And from the point of view of ease and pleasure, it's generally more pleasurable to be served pudding than it is to wash up. But at that point, you become part of the family to some degree. You enter a different kind of relationship with that place and those people, and it's less formal, it's more intimate, and it's more reciprocal, and it moves into a more sustainable mode. It is possible for people to see, well, any religion, I suppose, as a place where you get certain needs met, and you are kind of like a service user. You turn up to the Buddhist centre because you want the quiet there, and then you turn up to the Sikh temple because there's free food there, and then you turn up to the church because it feels a little bit more social, or whatever it happens to be. I mean, those are pretty crude examples, I think, but you're relating to the place as what you can get from it. And I think that is valid, and I think it's essential for a while. But I think to go deeper, you need to take responsibility for a tradition or a discipline or a place or a people or a community. You need to start seeing it as your own and seeing it as your spiritual home. And in doing that, you complete the circle. You engage in your practice in a more timeless way. Because whilst you're practicing for yourself and your own needs, there's a particular limitation to that. But when your practice and your involvement with a situation becomes the bridge between the thousands, millions of people over thousands of years in the past who have worked to bring you this religion, this building, this community, you act as a bridge between them and all the millions of people and over thousands of years in the future. You've only got what you've got because other people have passed that on to you. And the degree to which you can participate in that narrative gives you a much, much bigger perspective on your own situation. There's something very human and very natural about engaging with people in that way. And I don't think it requires you to only have one religion or place in which you practice, but I do think it is closely linked to that, in that having more than one home adds a complexity to your capacity to invest with that kind of energy. And finally, from a practical point of view, or I don't know if the word's ecclesiastical point of view, anybody who turns up to a public event at the Buddhist Centre, obviously it doesn't matter what religion you are. Everybody is welcome to all public events. I think things become a little different if you ask to become a Mitra. So when you're a Mitra, one of the things is that you say that you are a Buddhist, and there are certain views that are required to be a Buddhist, in terms of acknowledging all things are conditioned and so on, the sort of things about God which I think would make it complex for you to say you're also a Christian. I don't really know how that conversation would go, actually. It would probably be quite a subtle conversation and require a lot of working out. And the other thing that you say when you're a Mitra is that Triratna is the primary context for your practice for the time being. So it's a provisional and it's non-exclusive, but it's sort of saying that it's the main context for your practice.
So I have noticed that on the whole, the way that I've responded to this question of, is this really possible? It seems like I've been saying no, 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 no. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case absolutely, let's say. I think if you're attempting to pursue both, I think you'll come up against limitations, and I think you'll come up with problems. But really, again, what's behind, maybe what is behind this question is the person who has asked it does go to church or a mosque or some other place of worship. And in that case, I wouldn't like you to take anything that I've said as, therefore you have to immediately choose. When people ask to become Mitras, they are actually encouraged to look at other traditions and other situations, because at a certain stage in your spiritual career, it is actually really important to shop around and to try different things out. I think it would be very difficult to end your spiritual career like that. But wherever you are at the moment is where you are, and you definitely can't just cut off what's going on for you. I mean, I don't consider myself a Christian. I don't consider myself theistic. I wouldn't place money on there being a god. But the culture that I've been brought up in, there is a God-shaped hole in my worldview. And certainly there's particular longings that arise in me that can easily find expression in the term God. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I believe that, but it's a complex landscape, and you've got to deal with whatever comes up authentically. You can't just sweep all that under the carpet and pretend that it's not there. Neither can you just squash it, but presumably neither could you deny the validity and the response that you have to Buddhism. And there's lots of reasons why we might be involved in other situations. It might be the philosophical or theological side. It might be the social side. It could be familial, that your family go there. It might be all sorts of things. So if what's behind this question is, do I have to give up my previous faith? I would say the answer to that is you don't have to do anything. But at the same time, what you do does make a difference. Anyway, I hope those rambles and reflections are of some use. I will post the text for 1.1.3 shortly, and do have a read of that. And I hope you have a good week.